Many Americans believe that their nation is in decline, and they're half right, kind of. Comparisons to the Roman Empire are so common that they've become toothless and cliché, and that's because of one key factor that people tend to miss in Rome's history. Remember that the Roman Empire didn't exactly fall. Rather, it split into East and West. Sound familiar yet? Well, it gets even crazier because the fracturing of the Roman Empire occurred due to social and political trends pulled straight from modern headlines. So, on this episode of Keyed History, we embark on a journey through time and space, discovering the secret parallels between ancient Rome and contemporary America that will shock, entertain, or black pill you, depending on your outlook. Let's begin. Part 1. Disparity. Rome's economy had vast disparities between the rich and the poor. Now, inequality is not inherently bad, and Romans mostly accepted their status and duty in life, as there was a kind of social contract between the plebs and the aristocrats. But the natural balance of power began to swing wildly out of control, which led to the rise of populism and class warfare. Elites stopped hiring natural-born Romans, instead importing millions of slaves from foreign nations. At some points, the Roman slave population made up as much as 50% of the populace. Slave resentment began to spread like wildfire, and the class divides grew even further. This is probably one of the most important points of this video. Resentment and the human psyche plays a huge role in many transformative periods in human civilization. Here's where it gets interesting. Slave resentment isn't just about being oppressed, it's about the psychological impact on both the oppressor and the oppressed. You see, slavery in Rome wasn't just physical bondage. It was a system that bred envy, bitterness, and a deep-seated resentment that subtly undermined the very fabric of Roman society. The underclass lashes out and is used as a weapon against anyone too weak to defend themselves. Eventually, some of the elites join in, using subtle tactics to direct the mob against their enemies. In Rome, slaves ran the economy from farming to mining to being household servants or even educated tutors. The foreign underclass was even permitted to serve in the Roman legions, similar to how the LAPD has begun to admit DACA candidates, one of which was later found to have gang ties. They had penetrated every aspect of Roman society and would inevitably help destroy it from the inside. Friedrich Nietzsche talked about slave morality, the idea that the oppressed create values to deal with their oppression. Strength becomes weakness, humility is considered a virtue, and the downtrodden feel a moral superiority over their masters. This dynamic in Rome led to a moral inversion where the once proud Roman virtues were questioned. For centuries, Romans prided themselves on virtues, courage, manliness, strength. But as slavery became more entrenched, these values started to be seen as oppressive or cruel by a growing number of people, including some of the elites. Now, consider the slaves. Their daily lives were a constant reminder of their subjugation, leading to a culture of passive aggression, sabotage, and sometimes outright rebellion. Remember Spartacus? His revolt was not just about freedom. It was an explosive release of accumulated resentment. This resentment didn't just stay in the fields or mines. It permeated Roman culture. Literature began to reflect this with works like Saturnalia by Lucian, where slaves and masters switch roles, or the works of Petronius, where the decadence of the rich is mocked, subtly critiquing the social order. Even in politics, the resentment played out. Freedmen started gaining influence, and with them came a shift in political power dynamics. The once clear lines between free citizen and slave blurred, leading to a society where traditional Roman values were increasingly questioned. The moral decay didn't just come from the slaves. The masters, living in fear or guilt of their slaves' potential rebellion, surrounded themselves with luxury and vice to drown out their anxieties. This decadence was a sign not of strength, but of a society eating itself from within. The fall of Rome, just like America, wasn't just due to external pressures. It was also the result of an internal psychological warfare. The resentment of the underclass, their passive and active resistance, their moral inversion, all contributed to a society that was as unstable as it was magnificent. Part 2. The border. The Roman Empire, at its zenith, stretched from the rolling hills of Scotland down to the sun-drenched deserts of North Africa, and from the Iberian Peninsula to the fertile lands of Mesopotamia. It was a beacon of civilization, innovation, and law. But as the empire expanded, its borders became porous, not by accident, but by policy. Emperors, facing labor shortages and military needs, welcomed immigrants, believing they could integrate them into the Roman way of life. However, the reality was far different, and the seeds of destruction were sown. See, Rome was known for its inclusivity. No, seriously. For centuries it absorbed various peoples into its fold, granting citizenship, and integrating them into its society and military. This policy of assimilation was a strength, but like all things, it had its limits. Enter the late 4th century. The Huns, a fierce nomadic tribe, began their westward march, pushing Germanic tribes towards Roman borders. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and others, once Rome's allies or foes, now knocked on Rome's doorstep, not just for trade, but for refuge from the Huns. In 376 AD, Emperor Valens allowed the Goths to cross the Danube River into Roman territory. This wasn't a small migration. We're talking about tens of thousands of people, a decision driven by military needs. Rome needed soldiers. But this act of generosity was Rome's undoing. The Romans failed to integrate these newcomers properly. Instead of dispersing them, arming them, and assimilating them into Roman culture, they were left to their own devices, often in dire conditions. This led to resentment, hunger, and eventually, rebellion. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD was a turning point. The Romans, unprepared for the ferocity and desperation of the Germanic warriors, suffered a catastrophic defeat. Emperor Valens himself was among the casualties. This victory emboldened the Goths, who soon became not just refugees but conquerors within the empire's borders. Fast forward to 410 AD, and we see Alaric and his Visigoths sacking Rome itself. The Eternal City, once thought inviolable, was plundered. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological blow. The myth of Roman invincibility was shattered, but why did Rome fall? Why couldn't they manage this wave of immigration? Here's where the lesson for today's world comes in. Rome's borders became porous, not from a lack of walls or legions, but from an inability to control the influx and integrate it properly. The empire overextended itself, diluting its own identity and cohesion. Economically, this mass migration strained resources. The lands could no longer sustain the population. Socially, cultural clashes ensued. Natural-born Roman men couldn't find work due to the influx of foreign labor. The Roman way of life, its language, customs, and gods were diluted. Politically, the integration of so many different peoples led to fragmentation. Loyalty to Rome was replaced by loyalty to one's tribe or clan. Rome devolved into, for lack of a better term, identity politics. Now, let's look at today. Are we not seeing parallels? Modern nations, with their open borders, face similar challenges. The cultural, economic, and social fabric of societies can be stretched thin when mass immigration isn't managed with wisdom and foresight. An empire, or any nation, cannot survive if it loses its core identity and the loyalty of its people. Rome's open gates led to its downfall, and history might be on the cusp of repeating itself. Part 3. Fertility rates. There's one of the most critical, and maybe also the most tragic cause of Rome's destruction, the very lifeblood of society, its fertility rate. In the days of the Republic, Roman families were large, driven by a societal expectation to produce soldiers for Rome's endless wars. But as wealth increased, so did vice. The patricians, once proud warriors, began to see children as burdens rather than blessings. Roman women, empowered by new laws and a shift in culture, chose luxury over legacy. Wealthy families started to limit their offspring, opting instead for slaves to do the work and gladiators for entertainment. Contraceptives and infanticide were no longer whispered secrets, but openly practiced. By the late Republic and into the Empire, Augustus himself noted this decline. He instituted laws like the Lex Papia Poppaea, attempting to incentivize marriage and childbearing, with penalties for celibacy and childlessness. But these measures, while well-intentioned, were too late or too half-hearted. What ensued was a demographic catastrophe. The population stagnated, then declined. The vibrant youth of Rome grew old, replaced not by Roman children, but by immigrants from Gaul. The legions themselves suffered. Once the backbone of Rome, filled with citizens eager to prove their valor, they became increasingly manned by mercenaries, men with no stake in the future of Rome, loyal only to the highest bidder. In the Senate, debates raged, but the cultural shift was irreversible. The Roman spirit, the discipline, the family values that built an empire were being eroded from within. Luxury had replaced virtue, and with it, Rome's ability to sustain itself. The lesson here is stark. A civilization that ceases to produce its next generation is one that votes for its own decline. Are we witnessing a similar pattern today? Well, yes. Modern societies, with their declining birth rates, face similar threats. The strength of a nation isn't just in its economy or its military, but in its people, in their numbers, in their vigor, in their willingness to continue their lineage. Part 4. The Culture War. Now, when we talk about cultural civil wars, we're not speaking of battles with swords and shields, but a clash of values, ideologies, and identities. Rome was essentially an empire of cities. However, the rural populace often felt alienated from the urban elite's lifestyle and politics. This divide wasn't just geographical, but also cultural. The countryside held on to traditional Roman values, while cities became melting pots of foreign cultures, religions, and philosophies. With cultural divides came political factions, each backed by different cultural groups. Emperors rose and fell, not just by merit or conquest, but by pandering to these cultural blocs, leading to a carousel of power. At the core, there was a significant divide between the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. The Latin culture was deeply rooted in Roman traditions, law, and the military, whereas the Greek parts of the empire were centers of philosophy, commerce, and early Christian theology. This wasn't merely linguistic, it was a profound cultural schism that affected everything from administrative policies to imperial loyalty. With a significant portion of the legions now filled with barbarian recruits, military leaders often had their own agendas, pushing for emperors or policies that favored military expansion or integration with these new cultures. Emperors like Constantine, who moved the capital to Byzantium, exemplify this shift towards Eastern and Christian influences. The common people, or plebs, were swayed by bread and circuses, but also by the cultural shifts. In the cities, especially Rome, there were factions that supported traditional Roman games and festivals, while others were drawn to the new Christian ethos, creating a vibrant but volatile urban political scene. In the provinces, local elites would back emperors who promised autonomy or benefits for their regions, often aligning with whichever cultural or religious faction was in ascendancy, whether it be the Hellenistic culture of the East or the more conservative Roman traditions. Diocletian even tried to stabilize the empire by splitting it into the tetrarchy, each ruler representing different cultural and political interests, attempting to balance these divides rather than choosing sides. But it was all in vain. Rome lost its unifying narrative. What was once a city with a mission to spread Roman culture and law became a conglomerate of competing identities. Sound familiar? Part 5. The Swamp. The rise of Rome was meteoric, and with every new territory came new wealth. Senators, once public servants, became landowners and power brokers. The Senate, meant to be the voice of the people, turned into a playground for the rich and influential. The equestrian class, originally Rome's knights and administrators, began to blend with the senatorial elite. This wasn't just a class shift, it was a seismic shift in power dynamics, where wealth dictated policy, not virtue or capability, or, more importantly, blood. You see, the Roman elite believed in the strength of bloodlines. They encouraged the breeding of the strong, the brave, and the intelligent, while subtly discouraging or outright preventing the propagation of those they deemed inferior. This wasn't just about slaves or foreigners, it extended to the Roman populace itself. At first it seemed beneficial. Rome produced some of its mightiest generals, its most cunning senators, and its most dedicated engineers. The Romans, in their expansion, absorbed not just territory but people. They brought back not only gold and glory, but also the genes of those they conquered. Over time, this led to a significant shift in the demographic makeup of the empire. What was the outcome? The unique Roman character, forged through centuries of shared history and lineage, began to blur. The loyalty to Rome, the cultural cohesion, and the genetic traits that produced generations of disciplined legionnaires and shrewd senators began to dissipate. A Stanford study on Roman genetics actually found that the Roman genome was radically altered over the course of only a few hundred years. As Rome's people became a mosaic of the world, so too did their allegiance and cultural practices. Today we see similar patterns. Globalism promotes the blending of all cultures and races into one indistinguishable mass. But at what cost? The loss of unique identities, the erosion of national pride, and potentially, the weakening of societal bonds that hold nations together. Anyway, back to corruption. Enter the Praetorian Guard, originally protectors of the emperor, now kingmakers. They auctioned off the empire to the highest bidder. Emperors like Didius Julianus came to power not by merit, but by outbidding competitors. Unaccountable and unworthy politicians grew in number, and eventually Rome lost its ability to maintain basic functions like maintaining roads of the military. I hate to sound like a broken record, but sound familiar? Part 6. Feminism. The insidious creep of modern values began to infiltrate Rome. Women started gaining rights. They could own property, they could inherit, and some even dared to influence politics. This might sound progressive to the bleeding hearts out there, but for Rome, this was the beginning of the end. Empowered women started to challenge the established order. Marriages became less about duty and more about personal choice. The sacred bonds of family weakened. Divorce rates soared. Fertility dropped. Why would a woman stay home when she could be out there competing with men? This was the cultural implosion of Rome. As women's roles expanded, traditional morality collapsed. The family unit, the smallest and most vital cell of society, was undermined. Men lost their purpose, their honor, their drive to protect and provide. Weak men create hard times, and Rome was no exception. And here's where it got really bad. As women gained more power, they influenced politics. This led to policies that softened Rome's once ironclad military might. Soldiers were more interested in their rights than in Rome's glory. The barbarians didn't just invade, they walked right in because there was no real resistance. Sound familiar? Just look around today. Feminism, women's rights, they're tearing at the fabric of our society. They're pushing for more rights, more power, less traditional family structures. And what do we get? Declining birth rates, moral decay, and a society that's ripe for the taking by those who still hold on to the old, strong values. Part 7. Bonus round. Here's a bunch of random stuff that didn't get its own section. Welfare state, the annona or grain dole system, where free or subsidized grain was distributed to citizens, created a dependency culture. This welfare state, much like today, undermined the work ethic and self-reliance of Romans. Decriminalization of homosexuality. The acceptance and even celebration of what was once considered deviancy indicated a broader moral shift, prioritizing personal freedoms over societal norms. The extension of Roman citizenship to non-Romans, employment of eunuchs in the Roman government. The debasement of the currency during various crises led to inflation. Price controls, or Emperor Diocletian's edict on maximum prices in 301 AD, attempted to control inflation by setting maximum prices for goods and services. The growth of cities at the expense of rural life, leading to a disconnect from traditional Roman values associated with land ownership and agriculture. The rise of a merchant class and the importance of trade could be criticized for shifting the empire's focus from conquest and land to commerce. Legal reforms, limiting retaliatory violence, an emphasis on cosmopolitanism. The decline of Roman education, the expansion of the bureaucracy, the decline in physical fitness, the decline of Roman language use, changes in military dress and tradition. The fall of Rome wasn't overnight, and neither is America's decline, should we choose to see it that way. It's a call for introspection and action, and we stand at a crossroads. Will America rise from its current challenges, or will it continue down a path that mirrors the decline of Rome? This isn't just America's story. It's a warning for all of us. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history, politics, and the future of our society. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, stay keyed.